and you can take your choice of first, second, and third time. That's not a guarantee that you'll get any of those times because I like how she put it. What did she call it? A masterpiece of scheduling. What a beautiful way of saying a nightmare. Okay. So anyways, we'll see how it goes. All right. Another little note. All those things that have been languishing in my office, you may come and get them, my friends. Okay. You also, inside them is feedback from the cooperating teacher, and it's important that you have feedback from me too. I'll be emailing you that because I don't like sticking that in the binders when they're sitting out there. I just don't like it. So, you can look for that to arrive in your inbox. All right, and I will say, even though class where you did those experiences are a distant memory, your growth certainly isn't. So if you have questions or want to talk about things from that experience, my door is open to you. Okay? All right, so today, I find this is a really fascinating topic. We're going to launch now into certain causal issues to consider with reading problems. And when we look at these causal factors, we're going to look at physical issues. We're also going to look at environmental and social issues, and we're also going to look at neurological issues. But today I want to focus on the physical. And certainly there's a whole host of physical needs that impact learning. And a lot of what I have to share are things that just impact all learning in general, but I'm trying to look at it through the narrow field of reading. And I will say that I'm focusing most of our talk today on vision and auditory issues, okay, because they're the most prevalent. Now, that is not to say that other physical issues don't impact reading achievement. I mentioned the story of the young man who had cerebral palsy that I taught, and I mentioned that his gross motor needs were such that unless we had put careful thought into how to make adaptations to his beginning reading program, he would have had further challenges with learning how to read. So I don't want to negate those other kinds of physical factors, but I find that these two areas are things that can be rather hidden to teachers. They can not necessarily be aware of the nuances of how these things impact students. And so I want to explore those a little bit more in depth. All right? So the other thing that I always worry about is that this will be too much of a review for you from other courses. So as we jump into this, and if you've had a lot of this already, then you need to say, well, we discussed this in this class, and we can have more of a discussion about how this impacts reading instead of from the ground up kind of dialogue, all right? A couple caveats, all right? I have a doctorate in instruction and learning with a focus on reading literacy. That is not the same as a medical doctor, okay? You know that, right? My kids know that for sure. What good is your doctorate anyhow? We've had that discussion. So while I know about these conditions from a reading specialist point of view, I don't know them at the depth that a medical profession understands. Now, it would be great if I could have medical profession folks come in here and talk about these things, but the problem is they don't know how they impact learning at the same time. You see there's a happy medium somewhere in between. So I will say that I'm going to give my best shot, but later on if you go to medical school and you find that, oh, she could have described this condition a little bit better, then okay, that's why you'll be in medical school and not me, okay? So, but this is really, really important to understand, okay? One of the things that is important to understand, whatever these causal factors are, whether we're talking about physical factors, social factors, neurological factors, too many professionals in our field just focus on what are the problems. Like I've heard people talk about disabilities. Sometimes some of the language that we use for disabilities only shares what the problem is instead of sharing what the need is. You know, so for example, if you work with a student and they have an IEP and it says they're visually impaired, right? Do you know what they need from that, or do you just know they're visually impaired? So these things point to issues that you have to be aware of, but it's up to you to understand these treatment options. And also it's important to understand that even if you all of a sudden were to correct the sensory issue, there are still lingering effects of that sensory, shall we say, deficit that is going to impact a learner for a long time to come. A couple quick examples, right? So let's take vision, because I live with a kid who has this vision stuff, right? I can remember very vividly, you know, and the guilt you feel as a mother is tremendous, but I remember the day after Gabriel got his glasses, he came running downstairs, and he was in kindergarten at the time, and he said, "Mom, I looked on the screen of my window, and there was a fly there, and did you know flies have wings?" Yeah, like, and as a parent, you're like, "Oh my gosh, that's how bad your vision was." That now, but the mere fact that he all of a sudden could see that did not erase how his vision was impacting his reading achievement. Okay, because of several factors. One, that's just a focusing issue. It's not a coordination issue. Two, he needed occupational therapy to learn to hold his pencil, because while other young babies were playing with tiny little things, he didn't even see those tiny little things to play with them, so he never developed those little tiny fine motor skills that most people develop naturally. You see those as lingering kinds of issues? I have a good friend whose daughter has a very significant hearing impairment, and this young lady was fortunate to be able to have some assistance through surgery, which really went a long way to helping her to expand what she can hear, okay, through a cochlear implant. That's fantastic, but she still missed all this developmental stage of learning phonological awareness. That child is still going to need significant support in their reading achievement. All right? So just because you can start treating it and you can give the student assistance with those issues does not necessarily mean that things are going to be instantly fixed. Make sense? Okay, very good. So let's talk about visual problems that impact reading, all right? We're going to talk about acuity issues. What I mean by acuity is sharpness, how well you can focus on things. We have a whole list of stuff there that we're going to get into, and we're also going to talk about problems related to not just how you focus, but also how your eyes work in tandem, all right? So this middle group is all about how your eyes move together, how they process the visual field together, all of those lovely things. And we're also going to mention a few things about how we screen for vision problems, all right? Tell me, have you had is this review for you, this kind of stuff? Okay, good. I hear, oh, great. Okay, I mean, it's not good, like, but that's why we're here, right? Okay, so let's talk about some of these acuity issues, all right? So here we have a diagram of the eye up here. Here's where I need a laser pointer, right? So let's look at the top one for a moment, okay? That's a normal diagram of what happens when we process images from a quote-unquote normal eye. All right, we are beautifully designed, and the way that the design works is that the image comes through these lenses, if you will, right? And then it focuses on the back of our eye, all right? So to go back, I think that I have this on this other chart, right? So they come through the cornea, through the lens, and we come back here, and the image is supposed to rest on the back part of the eye. All right, I think that's the retina, right? And you don't know, okay? But anyhow, that's when you go to medical school, you can call me and tell me if I'm wrong. Okay, and that image then is transferred to the optic nerve, which takes the image to the brain for processing. So in a normal eye shape, the image lands perfectly on the back of the eye and is picked up by the optic nerve, and we're off to the races, right? Eyes that are myopic, which is a fancy word for nearsighted, okay? So if you're myopic, you're nearsighted. Do we have any nearsighted people in class? Okay, all right, very good. We've got a couple. Eyes that are myopic, when you are nearsighted, it means that things that are at near point to you come into sharper focus than things at far point, right? You see how that works? And the reason why is because the shape of the eye is a little bit elongated, and so when the image comes through and is focused, the point of focus doesn't land perfectly on the back of the eye. It lands a little bit ahead, right? So you have this discongruence with your visual field, and you have a situation where things at near point are easier to see than things at far point. That's myopia. We're going to talk about how this impacts reading in a moment, all right? I just want to get the basic definitions down first, right? All right, now, here's the opposite, okay? This is hyperopia, okay? Beyond the optic nerve, right? Isn't it like Greek language is interesting? Okay, so anyhow, so in hyperoptic people, you have a situation where the eye is not elongated, it's a little smushed. Isn't that a beautiful academic term? Okay. I wonder your notes, what they look like. Okay, so like the eye's a little bit smushed, right? And the eye's a little bit condensed. And because of that, the focusing goes a little bit beyond, and so this creates a situation where things at near point are more blurry, and things at far point are easier to focus on, right? Now let me just check and make sure that I'm not stealing my thunder. No, I'll go back to astigmatism in a minute. Okay, so you got that one? Okay, so take a little mental break, right? I want you to talk among yourselves about how does this impact the learner in your classroom. If you have a myopic student, what are going to be some of the challenges for them? If you have a student who is farsighted, hyperopia, right, then I want you to talk about that. And again, bear in mind, this is an interesting fact. When you deal with very young children who have these conditions, it often takes time to find the right kind of prescription, all right? Gabriel is in 6th grade. His prescription has changed every year. The reason it has changed every year is because his eyes continue to grow, his body continues to grow, and two, as his vision gets corrected, his mind makes adjustments, and he's, it's just a process. So again, like, instant correction doesn't mean instant going away with issues. There's still, I was in the, he had a doctor's appointment when I had to leave early on Monday just to take him to a doctor's appointment. And, I don't know how you are with your eyes, but those words on the back of that chart, I can read them all. And I'm middle-aged and probably really should have glasses, but I'm too big. Okay, so anyhow, but Gabriel, he can't read them. All right, that's even with his glasses on, he can't read that. All right, so understand that just the correction is not necessarily going to get them all the way that they need to be if they have a significant issue. So have a little discussion. What are some of the school challenges for the hyperoptic individual and the myopic individual? All right, go ahead.
Well, with myopic, you need to have things in your classroom, put them in front of the classroom so they know how to see, like they can see the board, write in bigger letters, and it helps everyone, but especially those students.
Yeah, well, I'm myopic
So that's what I remember. Yeah, like making sure that when the teacher, because like some teachers it'd be easier for me to read just because of their handwriting, and so I thought that was something that's interesting. That even if I was like up in the front of the room, I still couldn't see it because the handwriting stopped me. Right. I don't know. Being yeah. Some have a problem with that as elementary teachers, but that could be a problem for high schoolers. Yeah. I think for hyper objects, just maybe moving them further back in your class. Like if they can see things further, maybe putting them in the back. Would that help? I don't know.
Okay? Let me pull you in and let's have a discussion, okay? So let's go back here and let's start with the myopic condition. Okay? What are some of the reading issues that we might see for school students who have this kind of visual issue? Yeah.
They might not be able to see the board if they're sitting in the back of the classroom.
Yeah. Okay, the board is going to be a huge challenge for them, right? Okay, so, that ability to be able to follow along with your instructions. So that means anything that is at far point, right? So you have a situation where if you're doing word walls, if you're doing phonics lessons on the board, so on and so forth, that distance is going to be more challenging for them. The adaptation's pretty simple. You make sure that they can have preferential seating towards the front, but that might not even be enough. So you might want to consider having them, have a sheet that they can follow along, okay, as you're working through it. That may be very important to do for that student. And as technology continues to improve, I should ask Dr. Pesich to research this, but there's probably an app for this. You can probably, with a pointer here, have something that picks up on a pointer down there if there's assistive technology for them. The main point is to reduce the need for them to be able to see a far point. Any other intricacies about that? Any other things? Yes.
I was going to say, like, with younger kids, like, it's something that keeps in mind, like, throughout the entire time, because, like, you might be the one that's realizing it. You know, so, like, if a student's having trouble, like, consider that.
Yes. And this is a really good point, and this goes with all visual issues. It is estimated that a full 40% of kids that show struggles with reading at early ages may have a visual issue that's either contributing to their reading problem or is the main cause of their reading problem. That is a huge number, a really huge number. So as a teacher, you have to be really sensitive to that. You should be looking for symptoms of whether children are struggling, okay, because it may not be very obvious. I mentioned, I know a lot about education and reading achievement. It wasn't until Gabe was in kindergarten that it dawned on us that he had a visual issue. Okay, so what are some signs? What are some things that would show that a child's having some visual problems?
If they're reaching for something and they're not, like...
Yeah. We used to think that Gabriel was just the clumsiest kid in the world, But yeah, so like that lack of coordination. I'll share his diagnosis after we go through a couple more. Okay.
Like their handwriting, they like incomplete words.
Yeah, and it may not, they can see right here fine, but their ability to learn from you, okay, even their ability to process environmental print, think about that, go back to primary lit, and think about how much a child develops about their literacy understanding just by processing those environmental print opportunities that are around them. For the myopic child, that is going to be a missing page in their development, or one that's pretty constrained. Okay? Any other thoughts? Yeah, headaches. Headaches, right? Yeah.
Squinting.
Squinting.
Your eye sticks in different places.
We'll talk about that one in a minute.
I have that.
Okay, very good.
They could not follow directions when they're written on the board.
Yeah. The kid that you think is just out to lunch may be to be the school challenges for them? What's tough for this child? Yes.
Having problems reading books.
Yes, exactly. Think about it, okay? So much of what happens with reading happens from year to year, right? And it's not just reading, it's going to be writing, it's going to be any task at near point for them is going to be a challenge. That's pretty significant when you think about all of the little tasks that happen at school, all right? Yeah.
I was just wondering, would it be appropriate to have them sit in the back?
Yeah, I think for the child that has this type of condition, that you may want to think about having them sit at the back. The challenge with that, though, the only challenge with that is that as a teacher, it's harder for you to monitor how they're doing with this visual field, okay? So blowing things up at near point would be a perfect adaptation. Having that kind of, that's one of the adaptations. Well, I'm giving away one of Gabriel's issues. But he's hyperoptic. So he actually is given preferential seating in the front, not because he needs the acuity to see the board, but because the teachers need to monitor how he's doing with his tasks that happen at his desk. That's a pretty big deal for him. And he has all of his materials blown up so that he can see them more clearly at near point. All right? Make sense? All right, fascinating stuff. Okay, I want to go on to astigmatism. All right? Now, astigmatism, I'm sure that an optometrist is going to fall over someplace for me oversimplifying this. But hyperoptic conditions, myopic conditions, they deal with the shape of the eye at the back. Astigmatism deals with the shape of the lenses at the front, right? So when a student has astigmatism, what happens is you don't have a very good focusing mechanism at the front end, and the image comes in, and instead of being refracted to a singular point where it can land on the retina and be made sense of, it is refracted in multiple points, okay? And that creates a situation where everything is blurry, all right? So that's another condition, all right? Now, astigmatism is treated in a variety of ways. Sometimes one eye has astigmatism and the other doesn't, all right? So you have a situation where maybe one eye has issues with the focusing and the other one doesn't. So that might mean that you need different powers of corrective lenses. Sometimes the astigmatism is significant enough that the child has corrective lenses and a contact lens in one of the eyes. Okay, so it's all very dependent on their particular condition. All right. So let me move on. Come on now. What? No. All right. Another issue, and this one has less of an impact in learning, but given our high degree of technology that we use in schools and the ability to have, in my day, we had things off of a ditto machine when I was a student. But like now, students have lots of colorful things that they deal with. Color blindness is another visual issue that you have to be aware of when it comes to students and their learning. Students who are colorblind, it tends to be more prevalent in males than females. The slides here show kind of, it simulates what this would look like if you were colorblind, right? So this one shows the normal eye, and you have a situation here where you can kind of make out that there's a number in these dots. Can you make it out? Okay. Right? Okay? And, it looks like, from my perspective here, it looks like a 3. That's kind of what I see, right? And then over here, we have partial color blindness. This is not a 3, it's a 5, but, it takes a little bit more effort for us to see this. But if you were fully colorblind, you wouldn't be able to differentiate on these different things. In general, there are certain colors that are more challenging for the partially colorblind individual. The difference between reds and greens is a challenge. So, being aware that that could be a factor too, all right? That's one that really often goes undiagnosed until children are older. It doesn't reading, but we're talking about visual issues, so I'm gonna talk about all of them. Now, we get into amblyopia, all right? There's a term for amblyopia, which I don't really like, but it's called lazy eye, all right? And, yeah, okay, and so amblyopia, you can tell us all about it, right? Because you had this when you were a child? Okay, tell everybody about it. And there's other people who are saying, yeah, I get it, right? So.
Well, they said I was going blind and my eye was sticking in the corner, and it was because my right eye was doing all the, my left eye was doing all the work, while my right eye was just not doing anything. So I had to wear a patch over my left eye for 2 years so that my right eye could get stronger and be able to work. But it still affects me today because
it's a perfect example of how correction doesn't create just an instant fix. Keep going, yeah.
When I look at things today, like when I was trying to learn how to put my contacts in my eyes, my dad had to help me because I could never get it in, and he was saying that he would be yelling at me saying, "Stop moving your eye," when it would get close to my eye, but it's because as soon as it would get close, my other eye would take over.
That's right. Your other eye was more dominant, and so the power in that other eye overtook the eye that was less dominant. Okay, perfect. Okay, so amblyopia is a situation where the eyes have, for lack of a better word, less power. Okay, and there's two basic types. There is strabismic amblyopia, which is what you have. Okay, and there is refractive amblyopia. Now, strabismic amblyopia has to do more with the muscles around the eye, okay? And it means that one eye is doing all of the movement and focusing, and the other eye is not tracking the same way as that eye is. And for lack of a better term, you use the word sticking. It's kind of just being stationary, and that's why you get this term lazy eye. This child that we see here, who has one eye that's kind of moved in and the other that's staring straight ahead, he is experiencing strabismic amblyopia, okay? Now, the good news about strabismic amblyopia is that because it's something that you can physically see, it becomes obvious to people and it can be treated. The treatment isn't easy. In order to correct it, you have to train that other eye to not be, for lack of a better term, as lazy. You have to train it to move, and that does usually involve putting a patch over that eye that is more dominant, so that the other one is forced to process visual information. Okay? Isn't our body fascinating? That's fascinating stuff. I just think that's amazing, right? Now, refractive amblyopia is a little bit harder to diagnose. It's a little bit harder to see, okay? With refractive amblyopia, you have a situation where it's not the external movement of the eye, it's what's happening internally with the focusing. You have an eye that is really adept at processing images on one side, and one that is not adept at all at processing the images, and you can't really find a physical reason for why that's happening. It's treated the same way where you patch the eye that's more dominant, and that usually leads to correction. But it's harder to diagnose because you have a situation where it's not as physically obvious that that's happening. When it is left untreated, over time, you can become blind in the amblyopic eye because it gets used to not being used, and over time that visual skill atrophies to the point where it's lost. So early intervention is incredibly important with this. Children who have amblyopic problems, in terms of how it impacts their learning, well, it's better if your eyes can work in tandem. That's much better. Sometimes they get fatigued easier, but then there's also these depth perception problems. So we're almost at the point where I can tell you that Gabriel, in addition to suffering from hyperopia, also has amblyopia in one of his eyes. Okay, and fortunately for him, it was mild. So it wasn't something that he needed the patch for. If he had had the patch, I don't know what the kid would have seen combined with all the other things that was going on with him. But he has one lens in his glasses that is a little bit different than the other. Oh, and he also has astigmatism. Okay, so he's got a couple of things going on there. And that's a good example to say that a lot of times these things don't present themselves in these nice, neat categories. They're kind of, layered upon layered upon layered. All right. And then we get to convergence disorders. All right. So sometimes this is brought about by amblyopia. Sometimes it's just brought about by subtleties in the way that students process print. But this is what happens with convergence disorders. You can read all through that later. I'm just going to put it simplified. It's what we technically call eye teaming, all right? And it is the ability for your eyes to work in tandem and to move across print and to any visual stimulus to be able to process that as a unified team. You can see how if you have amblyopia, that's going to be a challenge, right? Okay. If you have amblyopia, in general, you're going to have some convergence issues. What happens to students who have convergence issues is that oftentimes when they begin a reading task or a writing task or those kinds of things, they don't show initial problems, but over time they get fatigued, and as they get fatigued, their eyes don't team correctly, and one eye might be a little bit ahead of the other one, resulting in a situation where they have double vision. Okay? So that's another one of Dave's problems. He has a convergence disorder too, okay? Or bugaboo, right? Okay? It's getting a lot better. This is one of those things that with eye exercises and with continued improvements in his prescription, this tends to reduce. But this is one of those things as teachers that it really doesn't matter how much you're going to blow stuff up and all of those things. If you have a convergence disorder, and certainly the smaller the print, the more stress it is, the more physical work it is for your eyes to team together. But if a child has a convergence disorder, they are going to get fatigued much faster when it comes to doing academic tasks. One of the things that is a common thing to keep in mind with reading for kids who have convergence disorders is that they need more breaks in the visual field of what they're looking at. So if everybody's reading a story and it's one page, okay, blow it up, give them more white spaces on the page so that they have more space to be able to process the information so the lines don't run together as much for them. Also be aware that they're going to need more frequent breaks from the visual task. When Gabe was in first grade, one of his adaptations was that he was allowed to push all the things away from his desk periodically and cup his hands to create a little dark cave, is what he was taught to do, and rest his head on the desk so that his eyes would have a visual break. Because of his convergence disorders, his eyes were getting tired combined with his amblyopia, and that would put a lot of strain on his processing. You see how all that works? That's some fascinating stuff, isn't it? Really, really interesting. Now, here's, let me make sure that I'm moving in the right direction. Here's the thing about these visual disorders. They're not necessarily obvious, okay? One of the things that we typically do with school-age children is we give them this chart to do in the doctor's office, and they stand about 20 feet away from it. And if they can read a particular line at 20 feet away, this is the one. If you can't read it from 20 feet away, don't panic. These projectors are getting old. But this is the one that's considered 20/20, right? And it's fun to watch you guys in the back row. You're like, what do we need to see the optometrist? This one right here, okay? So anyhow, do you want to know what it is in the back row? It's DEFPOTEC. Well, you have it on your screen. What am I talking about? But anyhow, did I not tell you this is on our handouts? Are you madly writing notes? Good thing I got that thing last year, right? Okay, so anyhow, if you want this PowerPoint, it's on my GCC. Anyhow, we give children something other than their vision, okay? So we see these different kinds of charts that are made to kind of get around that letter naming ability. You know, you have objects. I can remember when Abby was doing this one with the objects, she had the most interesting titles for the things. Like, most children would call it an umbrella, and she was, I can't even remember what it was, but she was like, an interesting mushroom with a curved tail. You know, like everything was a little bit beyond what was, you know, like the apple, she was like, is that a plum or a pomegranate? And, you know, here's your smile, please. Okay, but anyhow, you have these things, all right? Oh, she had one like this with the cross, and she said, she goes, Jesus' cross, did somebody cut the bottom off of it? Okay, anyways, you have these charts. Now, they're okay for measuring acuity, for measuring hyperopia, myopia. They can measure farsightedness and nearsightedness. Tell me, do you think these charts are good at figuring out amblyopia? You think they're good at figuring out convergence disorders? In some ways, they're not even so good at measuring astigmatism, all right? So, my advice to you when it comes to working with children that you suspect might have a visual issue is to not simply rely on whether they pass their pediatrician's visual screen or whether they pass the school's visual screen. Every school does this visual screen when children enter kindergarten. Do you know what Gabriel did when he was both in the pediatrician's office and when he was in kindergarten? Looking back on it now, I know exactly what he did. He waited for Ben to do it first, and he just cheated. It's true. He has an amazing memory, and I can remember looking back on it now, the intensity by which he watched Ben during his visual screening, and I would think, oh wow, Gabriel was really like paying attention to his brother, and looking back on it, it's like, okay, I can't do that, and I want to please the adults around me by doing it right, so I'm just going to listen to him, and I'm going to do it like he does. All right? Fascinating stuff, okay? So, the takeaway. If I could wave a magic wand, I would want all school-age children to see an optometrist or an ophthalmologist. You know the difference between the two? One has a more robust degree than the other. Okay, but anyhow, that's the difference. Again, somewhere, someplace in medical profession, it's like, what is that woman saying? But they should be seen. When children have a reading problem that is causing them issues, you should explore what the issues are. And too often we don't. And it's a shame because if Gabriel, not to toot my own horn, but he got diagnosed when he was in kindergarten because I knew what to look for. I knew to understand the subtleties of what was going on with him. I didn't know as much as I did about how these issues impact reading. He probably wouldn't have been diagnosed until 3rd or 4th grade. And I want you to think about how that would have impacted his school achievement over time. How that would have impacted, this is the thing that kind of scares me, his perception of himself as a learner. Okay, so screening is very, very, very important. Okay, this talks about some tools used by the optometrist. The bottom line is they have the ability to see more internally in the eye than we do. They have, this many things within, so you understand. They can do a lot more robust measurements than just that eye chart. Do they use the eye chart? Yes, but they use a lot more other tools too. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about auditory problems before we go to. Any questions or comments about the visual stuff before I turn the page to auditory?
How do you determine if someone is near or farsighted if they also have?
Yeah, so I think, I don't know, I think that, I think you need a, I think that I could call Dave's doctor and we could ask them, but I think that in terms of schools has the ability, I don't know if it's with a laser or what, but it measures the interior of that eye, okay? This guy who's aiming the gun at her, you know, is looking at the interior of the eye. And so if you haven't been to the optometrist or you haven't been there recently, you know, when you go now, most of them put all these computer diagrams up of your eye. Some of them have special machines that do a lot of mapping of your eye. And so they can really get into some pretty robust kind of understanding about how the shape of your eye, in the shape of your lenses even, is impacting your ability to perceive the world. Fascinating stuff, right? All right? Okay. Now, auditory issues. I'm going to confess I don't know as much about this because I don't live with people that have hearing problems except for me. And I will say that there are some things that we have to keep in mind. Just like vision is not just about can I see it. It's also about can I team things together? Can I be able to process what I see appropriately? Oftentimes when it comes to auditory problems in children's learning, the thing that we focus on as teachers is just can they hear me or can they not? And it's a lot more layered than just those issues. So we do have issues with auditory acuity. We have issues with the outer ear. Sometimes students have issues with that where maybe, you know, I know a young person who had experienced severe burns when they were younger, and so the shape of their outer ear is a little bit different, and that has an impact on how sounds are funneled into their ears. So that's an example of how sometimes there's issues with the outer ear. Okay, we have a lot of issues with things that happen with the middle ear or inner ear or the auditory cortex. The auditory cortex deals with the inner ear and how the auditory cortex is located in the brain. It's beyond the ear itself. But this is a processing issue in the brain, but it's that coordination of what's happening with these physical features and what's happening with the processing, okay? So all of these different areas can impact acuity. And a lot of times with audio problems, people think, well, if the child has audio problems, we'll know that when they enter school because it'll be obvious. Well, you know, there are factors that create audio problems over time. Trauma, exposure to loud noises can create a situation where you have a sensory deficit that was not there at birth. Ear infections can be something that cause children. So in some cases it can be temporary, in other cases it can be long lasting. So my point in sharing with that is that we can't be complacent as teachers and just think, well, if the child has a hearing problem, then no. You might not, okay? You have to be aware of these kinds of things. We also have issues, particularly for students that, and sometimes it might not be a physical issue, it might be something beyond that, but autistic children sometimes have very significant sensitivity to certain audio processing issues. And so being aware of that and understanding of that has an impact of that. And then we have something called auditory memory, and that's more of our ability to recall what we hear and be able to process that. You know, this auditory cortex is just this instantaneous, it's coming to my brain, I'm processing it. But beyond that in the brain, we have places that store information and help us to retrieve that information. Problems with auditory memory can lead to problems with the basics of phonological processing and phonological awareness. And so we're still learning about how all of those things impact reading, but it's important for us to understand that it's not just about, is my child exposed to these things, what are their physical needs in these areas, all right? Now, this might be kind of fun for you to do between now and next time. There is, and maybe, I don't know, I haven't tested these links in a while, so hopefully they still work. One of challenge are, okay, like, yeah, I can remember, at our last pediatrician appointment, it was time for the kids to have their, audio skills tested. And at one point, one of my sons, I won't tell which one, was being tested, I felt like he was just waving his hand in the air because he was bored, you know, like, I thought, he's not really waiting, he's just kind of impulsive, and so there are limitations to how those tests are done, and just as I would advocate that if you have a child that you suspect having a visual problem, you can't rely on the simple screening with children who have more significant auditory problems. It is interesting the different things they can do for very young children. This is the typical setup where they have the earphones on and they raise one hand or they raise the other. But for very young children, they're not going to sit still through that process. So you can do certain things where you give them visual stimulation and you get them looking in one area and you put a sound off in another area and you see if they turn their head. You can do things like that. It's a whole fascinating field that goes well beyond my understanding. The teaching point for all of us as educators is that the subtleties of how we understand audio needs are significant enough that you can't just rely on that simple screen if you suspect there's a problem. Now, so you might try a couple of these links between now and next time. And I have like 30 seconds, so I'm going to keep rolling. But when we get back together, I think I've given you a link to a little audio test you can do on your own. We're going to talk about this. This is mine, all right? And this was from a couple years ago, so it's probably worse now. I wasn't kidding. I have some hearing issues, all right? Don't use that to your advantage, back row, and say things that I can't. Okay. But anyhow, right now I have this slight hearing loss, but if you notice, not across all frequencies. Frequencies are the tone that we are using when we are processing audio information. And interestingly, my frequency loss is right at the tone that my husband speaks in. Isn't that funny? I think that's hilarious. He doesn't think it's as funny as I do. I showed him the printout, and he just said, go see a real audio doctor and get it tested because you have more issues than this. But we're going to talk about this because the frequency of loss has big impacts on what happens in the classroom, and we'll jump in there, okay? All right, happy Wednesday! We will see you next time. Helpful information? Yes? Okay.
Actually, some of the links that you're putting in our folders aren't working.
Okay.